The church doors slammed behind her like a judge's gavel, and Clara Mendez stood in the drizzle with the echoes still ricocheting through her ribs. Unfit, a husk, a woman with a quiet womb that had become everyone's verdict. She had imagined grief would taste like salt and tea. Instead, it tasted like the sermon she'd been forced to swallow, practical, loud, and final. Her suitcase was a fist of clothes and a single photograph, her mother's smiling face that had once promised she belonged somewhere warm. Now the photograph felt as foreign in her palm as the idea of being wanted. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The rain flattened the town's edges and made everything smell like iron and old prayers. Clara's throat was raw from speaking the word that had broken the meeting. Sterile. The doctor's clipped syllables having been passed to the church's deacons and then passed again like contraband until even the ladies at the bake sale had learned to whisper it. Her life, neatly arranged on a timeline of weddings and babies, had clicked open and collapsed like a pocket knife. They had offered her condolences and proposals for useful work, teaching piano at the parish, tending to widows, marrying some older man whose own seed would compensate for her lack. Each suggestion bruised because it reversed the promise she had been raised on: marriage, children, and the small domestic empire useful women were supposed to tend. She had one ally in the town, a cousin who owed her a favor and couldn't stomach the church's finality. "Get out of here," Marta had said, slamming the cousin's car door with the same exasperation Clara felt in her chest. "Go anywhere but here. If they think you're smaller than a woman because of a doctor's word, they don't deserve you." The town had made its choice, and so Clara packed what dignity she could fold into a single bag and left the familiar grid of porches and picket fences until the asphalt hummed beneath her soles. The clubhouse found her at dusk, like a rumor she'd half expected and half feared. It sat on the edge of town where light quit early and industry met rust. Corrugated metal, a pawn shop with neon teeth, and the clubhouse, a squat building with a metal skull carved into the door and tires leaning like sentries. Motorcycles lay in a tangle outside, chrome shining wetly in the rain. And laughter, male, brash, and raw, spilled from a doorway lit by a single hanging bulb. Clara hesitated at the threshold with her suitcase, feeling like a trespasser in a place designed for people who knew how to take things. She should have been afraid. The club's colors were notorious: black, crimson, and a number that people said as though it had weight: 7. Gabriel Ortega, called 7 because of a superstition and a record nobody in this county argued with, held the bike patch everyone respected. He was a man whose decisions bent men and fates, who wore danger like a second skin and softened only inside the walls he chose to guard. Men spoke his name in different tones: fear, reverence, and sometimes boyish longing. Because boys who grow into men need something to measure themselves against. Clara stepped into the warmth and was immediately surrounded by the smells of oil, tobacco, and something domestic: stew, maybe, or the unmistakable aroma of bread. Conversation hummed in a dozen pockets: card games, a prospect recounting a story with elaborate hands, the low chuckle of elders who had seen clubs form and dissolve like storms. The dense walls were covered with patches and photographs, layers of history stitched in leather. The center of the room was a well of light where a tall man leaned against the bar, jaw hard as a coin and eyes like coal warmed by a hearth. He was Gabriel. Up close, his reputation of a blade made sense. There was a precision in the way he moved, a careful economy to his speech. When he looked at her, the sound in the room changed, as if everyone had tuned a string to his gaze. "You lost, sister?" someone asked, half laugh, half warning. The men calibrated her the way a herd would astray. Clara's voice surprised her with its steadiness. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I chose to be somewhere people don't care what the clinic wrote on a piece of paper." Gabriel's smile was small and inconvenient, a crease that didn't commit to warmth. He studied her the way a mechanic appraises a bike, looking at the frame, knowing where stress will show. "You know where you are?" he asked. His voice was low, edged with an accent shaped by desert and devotion. "This isn't a chapel, Miss Mendez." "It isn't," Clara agreed, "and that's why I came." A chapel would have echoed the same verdict. Murmurs ran along the periphery like water against rocks. Gabriel's hand slid along a tumbler rim, but he didn't drink. "We have rules here," he said. "Not many, but they mean something. You can't expect club protections like you expect handshakes at a garden party." She folded her arms against the chill and the heat the room exuded. "I don't expect protection. I asked for a place to sleep, somewhere to be when the town's laughter fades. If that costs me the bitter stares, then I pay." The conversation that followed tightened the air. A veteran, nicknamed Frankie because he refused a proper last name, took her suitcase and eyed the woman like a puzzle he had a piece of. "You sure about this?" he asked gently. "We don't take in too many outsiders. The club has had its share of ghosts." Clara thought of ghosts, her mother's soft hands folded in her lap, of the doctor with his sterile gestures, of bridesmaids' whispers. "I'm the kind of woman who knows how to be useful in a place that expects a narrow kind of usefulness," she said. "I can cook, I can clean. I can keep my head down." Gabriel watched her, considering. "You said you came because a chapel would have echoed the same verdict," he said. "To watch mountains of doctrine crumble and still walk towards strangers, that's either bravery or a kind of stubborn that can get a person's teeth knocked out in other towns. Which are you?" "Both," Clara replied. The exchange was a small thing, but in that smallness the code of the clubhouse flexed. Offers and refusals were currency, so were tests. Gabriel had the ledger, and he added her name to it in a way that needed no ink. "We don't keep many women under the colors," he said finally, "but we keep the people we choose. There's a cost to belonging here." His eyes slid to the bar, to a faded mural of a woman whose face was painted half smile, half armor. "You want a bargain? Live by our rules. Be honest. We don't promise you children or dreams the town denies you. We promise something else. Shelter, the kind that doesn't judge your womb. And if any man looks to take what isn't freely given, hell answer to us." His words fell heavy, but they were handrails. Clara took them as such. "And if I refuse?" Gabriel's jaw tightened like a shutter. "Then you leave and go back to the place where people whisper and make verdicts of you like religion makes saints. Or worse, they'll try to fix you. There's no community of kindness for women like you, Clara. Only explanations." She tasted anger, a bright thing that made her stand taller. "You sound like you know about explanations," she said. "You're the one who keeps 7 children in your ledger and would rather be a president than a father proper." At that, the room's temperature changed. 17 sets of eyes turned, not with indecent curiosity, but with the recognition of a man's name that had the weight of stories. Gabriel's expression smoothed into something private. "7's a number," he said, but there was a tightening in his mouth that suggested otherwise. "I've all the children I can carry. Some by blood, some by favors, some by the mistakes of being young and thoughtless. I'm not proud of how some of that went down. I try to fix it." "Fixing isn't a ledger," Clara said quietly. "It's messy, and it confuses people who like clean lines." Gabriel studied her, as if trying to see whether her words would be a match for his truths. She read the calculation in him. A president who had built a fortress around his own soft places had learned that declaring affection as ownership complicated the business of keeping a club intact. He could offer a woman safety. He could not readily offer the latter without a cost. Yet the way he lingered when he spoke of the children, his children, in one way or another, softened a part of his face that his job hardened. "Come with me, then," he said finally. "Not a command, but an offer. Live at the clubhouse. Learn the rules. Pay what you can for rent or barter your usefulness. You keep your name. We keep our word. You won't need to answer for your womb here. If someone tries to make your problem his entertainment, they'll answer to me." It was a lifeline braided with rope. On one end, safety. On the other, a leash. Clara weighed the promise. It gleamed like something she'd been denied for years. Accepting it would mean stepping into a world where loyalty was currency and bloodlines were complex, where being wanted carried the scent of obligation. Turning it down meant returning to the town that had already tried to defrain her with a doctor's note. She was not a stray hoping for rescue. She was a woman who had just had a life declared impossible in the softest tones, and there wasn't a thing left inside her that wanted more softness. "I'll take the bed," she said, letting the decision be measured by her voice. "On your terms." Gabriel nodded, and the room exhaled. Men resumed their cards and conversations, but beneath the easy return to noise, there was a current. Women watching Clara with a careful kindness, an old prospect offering advice about how to sleep near the door. Frankie led her through a passage into a back room that smelled of oil and lemon cleaner. There were bunks, a small cot, a sink with chipped enamel, and a shelf stacked with tools and a child's toy truck. Voices from down the corridor, laughter, and the clanging of a wrench were like a distant sea. "Don't expect all of us to be saints," Frankie said, "and don't expect all of us to be monsters. We're complicated." Clara thought of the photograph she had smoothed in her palm and of the sermon like a verdict. Outside, thunder rumbled as if the sky had learned of her decision and decided to join the chorus. Inside, the clubhouse hummed with a life that combined danger and domesticity, steel and stew. She was a stranger here, but the offer had been made. She had a bargain on the table with a president whose code was a sharp thing: protect what matters and atone for what was broken. As she lay awake that night on a cot that creaked when she breathed, she listened to the clubhouse breathe. It was a place of loyalties older than law and softer than reputations. In the dark, she thought of the town's door slamming and of a man called Seven who kept 7 children and perhaps kept a place in his heart where a woman could be more than a verdict. She did not sleep with certainty. She slept with the knowledge that she had chosen a new kind of exile, and that every exile carries its bargains and its scars. The next morning, the clubhouse smelled like bacon grease and gasoline, a strangely comforting mix that folded around Clara like a coat. She woke slow, the cot's spring protesting as if it had learned to complain in time with the men's morning rituals. Light came in through high windows smeared with oil and rain, painting the bunks in a heathery gold. Voices carried down the corridor. Gabriel's voice among them, measured and small when he spoke to the kids, a different timbre entirely than the one used behind closed deals. She dressed without ceremony, smoothing the single dress she had brought until it lay like intention against her skin, and went out. The clubhouse had a rhythm she hadn't known she'd be able to read. Morning meant chores. A small army of women, some with the colors, some without, tended to the cooking while prospects cleaned bikes and veterans argued over the right torque for a stubborn bolt. Children appeared like bright punctuation, sliding between legs and clutching mismatched cups, their laughter absurdly unpoliced in a place that had very strict rules for most other things. Clara found herself watching them with a mix of fascination and ache, because the children were proof that life could splinter into unsanctioned shapes and still be wholly tender. Gabriel moved through it all like a man walking a line. When one of the boys scraped his knee on a stray chain, Gabriel flattened himself to the child's level, pressing a palm to the blood and swearing under his breath. It was the kind of soft that surprised Clara, unexpected and honest. She had come expecting a hardened leader who gave orders and measured risks. Instead, she found a man who could be ruthless with enemies and inexplicably present for scraped knees. "You're up early," Gabriel said, when their paths crossed near a table strewn with coffee cups and a half-finished crossword. He kept his eyes trained on the paper, a small concession to quiet. "I don't sleep well on the edge of other people's lives," Clara replied. "Too much noise of belonging." He gave a half-smile she couldn't parse. Belonging is loud when it's real. It asserts itself. She bristled the tiniest fraction. It also gets into people's heads and keeps them from thinking for themselves. Gabriel's answer was simply to lean back and let the question linger. "What do you think you want here, Clara? Safety? Work? Company? Or do you want something you can't name yet?" She thought of the photograph in her suitcase, of her mother's hands, and the curve of a smile that had once promised more than a life reduced to verdicts. She realized she could name something, though it wasn't tidy. "I thought I wanted refuge. Maybe I want a version of a life where I am not constantly having to explain a body I've been born with." He didn't look surprised by the honesty. "You'll have to explain yourself sometimes here," he said. "We ask things of one another. Loyalty isn't free." "Nothing worth having is," she said. Their workdays slid into each other like the teeth of a chain. Clara scrubbed floors and learned the names of the kids. Miguel, who liked to whistle when he ate. Anna, with her mother's stubborn chin. Tomas, who could recite engine parts and nursery rhymes with identical pride. She cooked in a pot that had been handed down like an heirloom, and tended to scrapes and quarrels with a patience that surprised her, even as it calmed something that had been tight in her chest for months. The women in the clubhouse watched her with the kind of guarded curiosity that ages into kinship if you are patient enough. Sometimes they offered a piece of gossip like a test. Other times they handed her a pan and the quiet of a woman who needed something to do with her hands. The men respected her in the particular way men respect a person who doesn't ask for charity and who understands the need for discretion. They told stories and omitted the parts that would have embarrassed them, and in return, Clara learned to listen for the places where pride met regret. Gabriel, in particular, held a strange power to be both open and closed at once. In the mornings, he could be near talkative, telling her about the first bike he'd ever fixed and how he'd traded a ring for a wrench when options were scarce. At night, when the clubhouse's scales tilted toward law and memory, he could be silent in a way that made her feel like a trespasser in his own history. One evening, a song came on the ancient radio, and Gabriel stood very still, a drink in his hand. The melody was older than any of the men there, and the mid-tempo ache of it seemed to empty the room. Gabriel's jaw clenched, and the hand holding his glass shook the smallest bit, enough that Clara realized some part of him was remembering a person or a place he'd kept locked. She moved across the room before she could think too much, sliding beside him at the bar. "You okay?" she asked, not wanting to pretend that her question was casual. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh if anything in him was given to levity that night. "There are things I don't like to remember," he said, "mostly because remembering reminds me of things I couldn't fix." "Like children?" The word was soft and sharp both. He met her gaze then, and for the first time he seemed willing to show the map of his errors. "Some of them are mine in the ways blood binds, some aren't. Some are owed to favors and debts. A few are the result of me being a stubborn, reckless young man who thought scars were trophies." He set the glass down and grounded himself on the counter. "I tell them stories when they're scared. I teach them how to ride safe. I make sure no one starves. But I can't always be what a father should be, Clara. I'm a president. My duties are complicated." Clara's throat made a sound that might have been pity, or it might have been recognition. "You carry a lot of contradiction," she said. "So do I." He laughed then, a small, dry sound. "We could be a mess of contradictions together then." Her laugh surprised her. In that moment, it wasn't a joke about future entanglement. It was the fragile start of something like complicity. He watched her with a new curiosity, as if assessing whether her contradictions matched his own in useful ways. The pull between them grew not like a sudden storm, but like a slow burn. There were moments, stolen and clumsy, where distance collapsed. He taught her how to check a spark plug, and she taught him to fold a fitted sheet the way her mother had taught her once. They argued about music and religion and whether a man like him could ever truly be forgiven by someone like the town they both had left behind. Clara found herself wanting less to be saved and more to be seen. And Gabriel, because he was a man who measured wagers and loyalty, found himself wanting to stake something on her presence. But belonging at the clubhouse came with strings no one untied lightly. A rival club, the Black Rivers, had been testing borders along the river for months. Tensions had been a low hum, manageable when it stayed in words and barbed glares, but the Rivers were restless and interested in expanding their patch. They had a leader who liked spectacle and a history with Gabriel that tasted of burned bridges and unkept oaths. Clara learned in short order that danger could focus like a lens when someone decided you were worth the cost of a war. It started small. A prospect returned one evening with a bullet hole through his jacket and a story about being followed to a gas station. Then tires outside the clubhouse were slashed in the night, a cruel message rather than a direct attack. Gabriel handled each provocation with the kind of ruthlessness that had kept his club alive. He held meetings at odd hours, mapping angles and responses, and his men moved with the kind of synchronous efficiency that came from being family in the way the club defined it. Clara watched him through all of it, feeling the swell of something tender and fierce in her chest, and also a coldness, an understanding that with Gabriel's code came unavoidable choices. She rehearsed the town's verdict in her head and realized with a rattling clarity that the clubhouse judged her with a different currency, one that demanded she prove herself in acts, not apologies. One night she was cleaning when a man she recognized as a visiting river came through the front door to the clubhouse, uninvited and dripping the scent of petrol and challenge. Gabriel emerged from the shadow of the hall like a blade drawn. "You lost?" he asked, his voice small and lethal. The man smirked, eyes flicking in a way that made Clara's gut tighten. "No," he said, "but someone from this clubhouse owed us a debt. We came to collect." Gabriel's hand hovered at his side where a pistol rested on a low shelf. He was measured and exact, carrying himself like a man who had turned threats into calculations. For a half-breath, the room held itself in that suspended place between violence and negotiation. "I pay debts," Gabriel said slowly. "I also know the difference between honor and dumb cruelty. What do you want?" The river's eyes flicked to Clara, and for a moment she felt like the currency in conversation, a prize or a bargaining chip. Something ugly in that glance made real the reality of her decision to stay here. It meant that men might evaluate her as part of a ledger in battles not her own. "We want to know which of your men keeps stealing our shipments," the river lied. "We think a woman here knows more than you let on." Gabriel's response was a look that made it clear he did not believe the lie. "You make a threat in my place. You leave with teeth missing," he said. It was not a promise, but a prerogative. The man hesitated, measuring. Then he laughed, a sound like gravel, and left the way he'd come, his departure a slow smear of threat. After the door shut, silence drooped heavy for a long minute. The men exhaled. The children resumed playing, as if the world had not tilted. Clara stood very still, feeling small and incredulous and oddly fierce at once. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, and she thought she saw something like relief pass through his face. He turned to her, and for the first time there was no curtain between his privacy and the invitation to cross it. "This could get worse," he said quietly. "I don't want you to think you're safe because you sleep inside our walls. There are things outside these walls that don't care about the rules we swear by. Clara's answer came from a place that had been hardened by a town that had failed her. I chose this, she said. I would rather face what comes with people who have rules than go back to a place that turned me into a verdict. He nodded, and in the gesture, for a moment, he seemed young and tired in equal parts. Then, we'll protect you, he said, but I will ask you for something in return. Name it, she said. He looked at her as if considering whether he could ask for the moon and expect no price. Stand with us when it matters. When the clubhouse needs you, be present. Loyalty isn't a one-way street. Clara considered the bargain. In the town she'd left, people had wanted her to shrink. Here, the expectation was that she would be useful in ways that mattered. It felt like a different kind of dignity, one that required action instead of endurance. I will, she said. As the week progressed, Clara learned to move through fights and defections with a new set of muscles. She found that being part of the clubhouse made the world both simpler and more perilous. Every kindness came with an edge, every protection with a potential reckoning. And as tensions with the Rivers escalated, so did an unstable, dangerous tenderness between her and Gabriel, a thing that made both of them more human and more vulnerable at the very moment the world was insisting they be otherwise. The tug between desire and duty tightened like a rope ready to snap, and Clara felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was standing on the cusp of decisions that would not only define her, but also test the loyalty the clubhouse had just offered her. The first time Clara heard the truth about one of Gabriel's children, it landed like a punch to the ribs, clean, unexpected, and leaving her breathless. They were in the garage at dusk, the air heavy with the smell of warm metal and sweet coffee someone had left on the hood. Gabriel was bent over a carburetor, grease under his nails, the light from a hanging bulb making the planes of his face more merciful. A boy, maybe 12, sat on a stool nearby, tracing the outline of a motorcycle with a stick. His ear caught a word, and he looked up at Gabriel with a question that had been practiced into him by too many nights of being half adult and mostly waiting. "Dad?" he asked, the sound slicing through the garage like glass. Gabriel froze. His hands stayed where they were on the carburetor, but the muscle at his throat worked. For a moment, Clara feared he would say nothing, and the silence would swallow them both. Instead, he straightened slowly and looked at the boy with a softness that made Clara ache, an ache that was not all compassion, not wholly sympathy, but something complicated and raw. "What did you want, Mig?" Gabriel asked. Miguel, the boy who whistled when he ate, using a name that made it plain how he threaded his life around the small ones. "How come you never told me my real birthday?" Miguel asked. "Mama says it's March, but the paper in the bedroom says April. She says it's because people are messy, but—" His voice trailed off. Gabriel's answer was a small, weary laugh that had no humor. "Because soft things are dangerous to say loud," he murmured. "Because some truths come with prices I wasn't willing to let you pay until you were old enough to understand them." He reached down and ruffled the boy's hair. The gesture warmed Clara in a way that made her want to weep and rend her shirt in equal parts. The boy frowned, the kind of frown that draws lines too soon on a child's forehead. "Are you my dad?" The question was as naked as a bone. Around them, the tools hummed. Somewhere, a radio played a country song. Clara felt the words like cold light pressed against her skin. Gabriel's face shifted, and, for the first time, she saw a crack in the armor he'd worn since she'd met him. "I'm the man who will kill whoever hurts you without blinking," he said simply. That counts for something. He did not say the legal word, father, but he said the thing that kept children fed, safe, and known. That omission, that particular carefulness in naming, explained a lot of the ledger he'd kept in the clubhouse. Some ties were blood, some were promises, and some were answers to the sins of a younger man who had thought courage meant never asking for help. Clara's chest tightened. She had thought she understood the complexity of his household, the odd children, the patchwork mothers, the favors unpaid and paid in different currencies. But hearing the evasions in his voice made his empire of caretaking suddenly more fragile. The names he'd given to certain kids, the stories he told when he wanted them brave, had been armor. When armor shows seams, it shifts the burden to those who stand near. That same week, a woman cloaked in perfume and old money arrived at the clubhouse with a smile that could have been used as a blade. She called herself Lucille. Her boots were scuffed, but her jewelry whispered wealth, and her eyes found Gabriel with the confidence of someone who had been noticed plenty in her life. She didn't introduce herself to Clara outright. Instead, she watched, a calculated observer who knew how to make a room tilt. Gabriel met her at the doorway with a courtesy that was cool and practiced. They spoke in the private language of two people with a history neither wanted parceled into rumors. Clara could not hear all their words from where she stood by the pots, but she saw how Gabriel's jaw tightened and how Lucille's smile sharpened. After their brief exchange, Gabriel's face looked older, as if a year had been carved in the space between two blinks. Later that night, she found herself in the laundry room folding shirts when she overheard fragments. "You knew the terms," Lucille's voice said. "Silk and poison. You said you'd provide, Gabe. You said you'd—" "And I did," Gabriel replied, the word and armor clanking back into place. "I did what I could." "Not enough," she insisted. "For the children, for me." Clara's hand stilled. The load of shirts became a sudden map to secrets. She realized that there were mothers in this orbit who expected more from Gabriel, more time, more marriage, more legally binding promises, because years had been unpaid and debts had been made into children. Lucille's arrival was not merely a social call, it was a claim. And claims in the world of motorcycle clubs were rarely resolved by polite conversation. The next morning, a photograph slid under her door made the inside of Clara's stomach flip. It was a picture of Gabriel with a woman Clara did not recognize, taken years ago. A wedding in a low-lit hall, a cake in the background, the kind of faded happiness that had been sourced from a desperate hope. On the back, in a looping hand, was written, "You promised, Gabe. You promised me, and you promised them." No signature, no address, just a hand pressing a ledger into the shadows. She took the photo into the kitchen, where Gabriel was sharpening a knife like a man who used ritual to stave off chaos. He didn't look up until she set the picture on the counter between them. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he told her the truth she had braced herself not to hear. She, Anna, used to belong to a time when I thought I could save a woman by giving her something I couldn't truly give. We were young and selfish and wanted to be heroes. She bore a child, and then the rest of it fell apart. I tried to make good in the ways I knew. He did not blame Anna. He did not flatter himself with the illusion that he'd done enough. "I never married her," he said. "I told her I'd take responsibility in ways that were messy. She wanted, needed more than I could give then. She left. She took the boy with her. I saw them sometimes. I sent money. But men like me know how to make promises like rope. Easier to tie than to hold for as long as you need." "And she came now?" Clara asked, trying to keep her voice level. The thought of a woman from Gabriel's past returning with a debt to collect wasn't new in her head. What made it savage was the way that debt could demand things from her: respect, status, silence, without asking. Gabriel folded the knife carefully and looked at the floor. She didn't. Someone else did. His voice cracked like an old hinge. Lucille represents a family that keeps accounts. She is not the mother, she's a collector. But what she wants is to change a ledger in a way I can't let happen. Lucille was not the only fracture. A prospect, green and hungry for acceptance, made a mistake that exposed a network of favors and secrets. He stole a shipment not meant for his club and sold parts to an outside dealer. Word of his thievery reached the Reavers, who used it as a pretext to escalate. In the aftermath, accusations were hurled not only at the prospect, but at Gabriel's leadership. Because leadership, in the eyes of those who keep score, is liable for the sins of those it shelters. The stolen goods turned into proof for the Reavers that Seven's Club could be infiltrated, that loyalties could be bought, and that Sarah in gossip now because some of the men took to renaming her to see if she'd flinch, was a weak spot. Clara found herself dragged painfully into the politics she had hoped to avoid. A woman at the biker bar, drunk and loose-tongued, claimed that Clara's arrival had been an inside job, that she had been placed there to soften Gabriel. It spread, rumors are flint, and in the days that followed, the clubhouse's quiet became brittle. Men spoke in low tones at the table where Gabriel held court. Allies looked at their shoes. The kids clung to each other like animal cubs at night. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Clara. No return, only a single sentence in a hand she didn't recognize. You need to go back to where people know how to break you quietly. The implication was both a threat and an instruction. Her first instinct was to fold the paper into a ball and burn it in the sink. Her second was to show it to Gabriel. When she did, he did not snarl. He read it, folded it, and slid it into his jacket. "They test us by testing what we love," he said. "People they want to hurt, they smash. They make your choices mean something else. They think they can remove your agency by reminding you what you lost." Clara's response was a silence that held fire. "I chose this," she reminded him. Her voice was not brittle, it was deliberate. "But I won't be used as leverage in a quarrel between men who think a woman's life is a card to be played." He looked at her, and for the first time there was something like fear in his gaze, a fear not for turf or pride, but for the fragile thing he'd begun to want. "I know," he said, "but sometimes the people who care about you most are the ones who will put you in danger because they cannot keep themselves from fighting for you." That confession was a kind of wound laid bare. It explained why he had offered her a bargain in the first place, not only to protect her, but to bring her into a system where his violence would be justified if directed at those who threatened his chosen family. But protection in that language came with strings. Loyalty could be demanded and, in time, given. It was a trade. In the same breath that he promised to shield her, he made possibilities for fracture inevitable. Those jealous of his attention, those who resented the privilege she began to carry, and the mothers who still demanded of him what he could not easily give. The pressure tightened until it cracked something fragile. One night, heated words flared between Lucille and Clara in the kitchen, both women intoxicated by indignation and the scent of frying onions. Lucille accused Clara, thinly veiled, of being a fortune hunter, of wearing her single status like a shawl to be protected while she harvested the safety Gabriel offered. Clara, insulted and raw, responded with an honesty that edged toward cruelty. She told Lucille, in a voice that shook, what it had felt like to be declared a husk by a town that counted wombs before wants. She told the room what it meant to have a life predetermined by one test. The men stilled. Gabriel's face closed like a book. He stepped toward Clara, not to silence her, but to shield the way one keeps a child from seeing something it cannot yet understand. "Enough," he said finally, his voice a command that did not carry the warmth of a father's call, but the steel of a leader. This isn't how we treat our women." Lucille took her leave with one final look that promised. "You built a family on favors," she said. "Be careful you don't lose more than you can afford." After she left, the clubhouse felt different, thinner, like a coat someone had taken a stitch out of. Clara slept poorly that night, dreaming of doors slamming, of old sermons, and a mother who had taught her how to sew patches on grief. In the morning, the children were quieter, and the men were careful with their laughter. For a while, everyone moved in the soft, spidered way of people waiting for the next fracture to split the room wide. The fractures came. A convoy of men came in from a neighboring town under the Rivers colors, not firing, but walking with the slow confidence of predators who had decided the hunt was time. They came to talk, to test boundaries. Words were exchanged, and in the dark, they broke other things. A window, a promise, a hand. A skirmish followed, a messy, ugly ballet of fists and fear. And when it was over, a prospect lay with a broken cheekbone, and the Rivers left with the look of men who had been stung and meant to sting back harder. The clubhouse was shaken, not by destruction, but by the truth that violence turned loyalty into another ledger. Who had bled, who had flinched, who had stayed. Men who had been quiet before spoke loudly now about who had led them badly. And whispers began to wind around Gabriel like a vine. Did Seven make choices that put his people at unnecessary risk? Had his personal debts, his intricate family, blurred the lines of his leadership? Even some of his own muttered that a president who held so many private attachments might be less able to be impartial, less able to wield the club as a unit. Clara felt the wedge of suspicion bite into her like frost. People began to glance at her with questions she had not earned. Mothers who had once been kind to her now eyed her like a loose thread that might unravel a sweater. Gabriel, who had offered her sanctuary, now found himself having to defend choices that were as much about his heart as his strategy. He defended her at meetings in low voices, and in public he placed himself almost savagely between her and the whispers. That protection was balm and chain at once. It tethered her, but also announced to the room that she was his to defend. The night the Rivers set a small fire upstream, an act designed to frighten, not to kill, Gabriel's response was immediate and blinding. He gathered men, rode like a man who had kept his bravest horses in the barn for emergencies, and chased down the arsonists with a ferocity that left the clubhouse shaken. He returned later that night, bruised, beautiful with the sheen of exertion, and Clara saw how thin the margin was between courage and ruin for him. He had chosen to put himself in harm's path to answer a threat to the children, to the clubhouse, and ultimately to the woman who had become a part of his life in ways he could not name. In the aftermath, the fractures did not close. Secrets had been aired, loyalties were recalculated. Some men who had resented Clara's presence now swallowed their resentment, but not without cost. Regard turned into something like reluctant respect, which is not the same as welcome. Others watched her like a test to be failed. Gabriel, exhausted and raw, held his club together with a fierceness that both rallied and repelled. The truth was that he had chosen to risk everything for people who had become entwined with his heart, an act that would brand him in some quarters as reckless and in others as necessary. The week closed with Clara standing at the edge of the river, the evening wind drawing cold across her face. Behind her, the clubhouse glowed, a little island of warmth and contention. In her hand, she held a scrap of paper, a line from Lucille's letter, burned out now, the edges eaten by use, and she realized that secrets had weight. They could be leveraged, bartered, and used as weapons. She had seen enough to know that belonging here would not erase the town's verdict, it would only reframe it. Here, she would be judged by a different standard: usefulness, loyalty, and courage. And there, under the wide, indifferent sky, a new fracture opened, not of anger, but of choice. Gabriel's world required her to be not merely a survivor of a verdict, but an actor in a life that asked for risk. The choice was raw and unromantic in its demand: to stay and be part of this messy, dangerous family, or to leave and bear the town's verdict alone. The river below did not answer. Clara folded the scrap of paper and put it into her pocket. She breathed the cold air deep and, for the first time since the church doors slammed, felt the tilt of a life she might shape instead of one that was simply given to her. Gabriel found her on the riverbank, the scrap of Lucille's letter already folded into raw patience in her pocket, and his face looked like a man who'd run until his lungs betrayed him. He didn't speak at first. He eased down to sit beside her and let the wind do what words could not. The smell of smoke still clung to his jacket where the men had chased arsonists, and he bore new bruises at his ribs that told of hands grappling him when teeth might have been easier. "You're not alone in this," he said finally, voice small against the river's steady hush. The confession was not a promise of victory so much as an admission of vulnerability, and for once he did not frame it as a command. Clara looked at him, saw the exhaustion under his jaw, and felt how close their private economies of hurt had come to matching. "I know," she said, "but being here means I'm part of what you fight for. I didn't sign up to be a ledger item, Gabe. I signed up to be someone who makes choices." He smiled then, a tired, proud thing that made him more dangerous because it showed him human. He reached for her hand, the gesture not bold but certain, as if duty had softened into need. "I don't want you ever to be used against me," he admitted, "and I won't let my failures be used to break you." They stood because waiting on riverbanks is a slow, polite way to postpone decisions. The clubhouse alarm cut through the night, two sharp notes that meant trouble, and they ran as if their feet could outrun history. Lights tore through the gloom as men mounted bikes and shouted orders clipped by adrenaline. Clara's stomach dove. Children's names folded through her thoughts like a litany: Miguel, Ana, Tomas. The choice Shed made to stay smelled now like the sacrifice it had quietly been. The convoy clattered toward the bridge where Rivers had staged a provocation, a line of hostile silhouettes and a truck loaded with burned timber, a thing meant to say, "We can eat your edges." Gabriel's plan unspooled in quick, practiced gestures, an arrangement of men and cover and a single thread of mercy. He told Clara to stay behind with the women and children. His voice tightened in that order, not command, but shelter. She should have obeyed. Instead, she shook her head, fierce and certain. "I stand where you stand," she said. "You asked me for loyalty. This is what it looks like." He protested with his jaw, as if her choice complicated lines he had drawn for the club. But then he held her hand and let the decision be mutual. He gave her a small pistol, not because she would need to use it, but because he refused to hide her from consequence. The gesture was an artifact of trust. He handed her agency, wrapped in lead. The confrontation was ugly and quick. Men shouted, leather slapped, and a single flare of violence turned a negotiation the Rivers meant to stage into a messy lesson about miscalculation. A prospect took a swing meant for one of Gabriel's, and for a breath, Gabriel's restraint cracked. He moved like a man who had spent years practicing the law of consequences, and when fists opened, they hit like history. Clara felt fear unspool into a hot wire inside her. She held the pistol uselessly, the weight of it a comfort. Then a shot cracked, another club signal or a stray bullet, and a cry rose from where the kids had been momentarily exposed. Clara's entire center rearranged. No ledger had a place for the raw panic of mothers and lovers. She ran. Gabriel was already there, already between a falling silhouette and the children he claimed by whatever measure held: blood, promise, and stubborn, ugly devotion. A man lunged for Gabriel from the shadows. Years of squaring debts and soft promises could not protect him from being hit in the back of the head. Clara saw the motion slow, as if moving through syrup, and in that delayed clarity she acted. She stepped between the attacker and Gabriel, the pistol a blunt answer to the immediate threat. The man went down hard against her, and pain flared, sharp, ridiculous, honest, through her shoulder. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the thin line of breath between them. Gabriel's hands found her as he pushed the attacker away. He didn't ask permission. He took her in his arms the way a man might rescue a child from the ocean, gripping, fierce, shaking all the threats into the night. His lips brushed her temple, a wordless benediction somewhere between apology and gratitude. Around them men cleared bodies and curses, and the rivers slunk away like wolves denied a kill. In the dim after, with adrenaline tapering and children clinging, Gabriel sat with Clara on the overturned crate that had once held beer and now held their breath. Her shoulder bled, warm and bright on her shirt, and he tore his own bandana to press against it. The intimacy of tending wounds in the open had nothing to do with romance at first. It was primal care, a human trade of blood and attention. His hands were steady, his fingers rough and exact, and she let herself be vulnerable in the only way left, by trusting him to keep the wound from widening. "Why did you stop him?" Gabriel asked, voice shaking with something he rarely showed, fear and relief braided. "Because you were mine to defend," she said. The truth sat between them like a crown neither had expected to claim. He met his gaze and saw in it the flicker of a man reconsidering the measure of his life. He laughed, a broken sound that matched the night. "I thought I asked you to stay behind." "You asked me to be loyal," she replied. "I am." He reached out and cradled her face with one calloused palm. "I never wanted to make you pay for my past," he said, confessing a debt he had kept hidden. "But I'm willing to give up my presidency, if that's what it takes, to keep you safe from the politics of my mistakes." Clara's breath caught. The offer wasn't made in bluster. It was a raw, possible sacrifice. She thought of him losing everything: colors, respect, the fragile stability he'd bought with years of compromise. And she thought of the children who needed the roof he kept. "You don't have to give that up," she said softly. "You can choose us differently." He studied her then, as if weighing worlds. When he answered, it wasn't the president's voice that ordered the room. It was a man who had learned to confess. "I will change the rules," he said. "I will be a different kind of leader. I will place the people's lives before my pride. But if that costs me my title, I will take the cost gladly if it buys you a life not defined by what you've been told you're worth." She let out a sound that might have been a laugh, a sob, and a yes. They sealed nothing with rings or vows. Instead, they sealed a covenant of messy, honest choices. Around them, the clubhouse rallied, patching wounds and arguing about lines and honor. The Reavers would lick their wounds and return, or they might not. That future lay across a map of decisions. For now, Gabriel knelt and kissed the place where her shoulder had bled onto his bandana. And Clara, with the taste of iron and adrenaline at her mouth, understood the shape of the sacrifice he offered. Not abandonment of power for its own sake, but a surrender that made room for a family that included her. When dawn came, the clubhouse stood bruised but whole. The children clambered onto laps and scraped knees were kissed. Men who had muttered about ledger and leadership now watched Gabriel consider a different path. He had not abdicated, he had redefined the terms. Clara, with a scar already forming along her shoulder, felt the strange warmth of being counted not as a deficiency, but as a chosen risk. They walked back to the clubhouse together, hands linked. The world was as dangerous as it had always been, but in the quiet between their steps, something true knitted itself into place. They would fight not for the clean, saintly lives the church promised, but for a salvageable, ugly, beautiful family made from the choices they dared to take. The morning after the fight, the clubhouse moved like a living thing, breath slow and deliberate. Scrubbed floors gleamed, coffee cooled in chipped mugs, and children clustered in corners with bandages and stories. Gabriel walked through the rooms as if he could stitch the nights together. A hand on a prospect's shoulder, a quiet word to an elder, a small nod toward Clara that said thank you without grand speech. She watched him with the kind of tired affection that knows what battles are worth choosing. They met in the kitchen, where the light pooled over a battered table. He pressed his forehead to hers and laughed, a small, honest sound. "We will learn," he said. "We will be different," she answered, and neither used the word throne or title. They spoke through plans: who would teach the boys to read, how they would account for favors, and when Gabriel would step back from decisions that thrummed with his old pride. There were apologies, not theatrical ones, but the small kinds. A hand that stayed when promised, a letter delivered, money properly routed to a mother, and a meeting called where the men were asked to speak about duty and mercy. The Reavers watched the club reshape itself and chose not to press a battle that would invite more ruin. Lucille left the county with a ledger that no longer bent the truth. Her threats found less purchase among men who had felt the cost of knives. Clara learned how to trust the mess of loving, that motherhood could be a dozen small acts, that being counted was not the same as being owned, and that scars made better maps than verdicts. Gabriel kept his promise, to put people before pride, and the club changed shape around that choice. Months passed, patched with laughter and grief, and once the kids chased a dog across the yard, Clara stood at the threshold, breathing light into herself. Gabriel caught her hand and squeezed it the way a man seals an agreement, quietly, fiercely, and with no need for witnesses. She leaned into the warmth of a place that had once scared her, and the final image hung over them: a child asleep on Gabriel's lap, a wrench by his foot, and Clara sewing a new patch onto a leather jacket, the stitches bright as the promise they had made to one another.